Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. There are many people who are attracted to the Remnant Movement. Why is that? I asked Denver Snuffer if it's true that people practice speaking in tongues in his movement. You'll find his answer very interesting. We'll also talk about Denver's views on Joseph Smith. Check out our conversation. So what would you say is the attraction to people who are attracted to your movement?
Most people have awakened to the realization that what they're hearing institutionally, either in polygamous groups or Community of Christ or Latter-day Saint, they've awakened to the realization that what they're getting fed from institutional sources is decidedly limited, misrepresentative, lacking depth. It's not soul satisfying, and these people are you would call them the best that there are. They're the seminary teachers. They're the bishops. They're the gospel doctrine teachers. They're the serious folks that have been on high councils. You'd be surprised at the substantial, thoughtful, reflective character of the people that wind up saying, "Oh, I'd like to go there," because you have essentially two choices. You either stay with something that you realize is not fulfilling and is insubstantial, and in many cases it's compromised and it's not doing its job. Or you say, "I've lost my faith in the institution, and therefore maybe the whole of it, the restoration itself, is just a sham." Many people are saved from going to the whole of it as a sham by discovering that there is great depth, profound insight, transcendently important material to be culled from the restoration. And if welcomed into your life, fundamentally change the way you view your existence here, the way you relate to other people here, and how meaningful your life becomes. Marriages have improved. People that were in conflict, who come in a search for the truth, reach a level of harmony between one another that is soul satisfying. These aren't people that I've converted. I've been out here trying to piece together as much of the truth as I can piece together, and I've been joined by people who have helped in that process. The work of the volunteers that put this together, I'm 1-2% of the effort that got made to do this. But I'm the beneficiary of it. The hard work, some of the hardest work, was done by a fellow who's sitting here on the Joseph Smith translation material. These are people on their own who have discovered that there are others like them, myself being one of them. And that has coalesced into now groups of people fellowshipping around the world together, donating, tithing, and helping one another with their financial needs, and meeting in conferences from time to time. And now we have leather-bound scriptures to rejoice in.
Well, and from what I understand, I'm trying to remember your other book, The Second Comforter.
Yeah, The Second Comforter.
Because in that book, that's the one where you talk about how, and please tell me if I'm saying it wrong, but how to have angels visit you. Is that right?
Essentially, yes. The Second Comforter, Conversing with the Lord Through the Veil, is a book that was written while I was an extraordinarily orthodox, gospel doctrine teaching, active Latter-day Saint, and its curriculum, its agenda, its teaching is trying to get a faithful, active Latter-day Saint to rise up to a higher level of practice of the religion so that you can stir the heavens and have some connection be made between you and the heavens themselves. It was absolutely correct orthodox doctrine of the church when that book was written. The manuscript was submitted to Deseret Book. They spent 7 months troubling over whether to print it or not. Ultimately decided not to print it, but encouraged me to get it into print. It got into print, And it's an orthodox statement of the highest aspirations of the church at that time. That teaching has since been renounced. You mentioned the Boise Rescue. One of the things they renounced up in Boise was the teaching of the Second Comforter, and they recently revised the footnoting in the Gospel of John to eliminate the previous footnote that confirms the doctrine you find in the Second Comforter conversing with the Lord through the veil, so that footnote, that connection has now been abandoned. I've been encouraged to do a third edition of the book and to rewrite it from my current perspective, but I believe it is more important as an artifact to show what the orthodox teaching of the LDS Church was in 2006 when that book was printed, in contrast to where they are today in 2020, abandoning what was once welcome, accepted orthodoxy. It's now heretical and denounced.
Well, to me, it would seem to be a bigger, the Second Comforter would be a bigger problem than passing the heavenly gift, because the church doesn't, would be concerned that angels, and I guess the question comes up.
But if you read the book and you look at the footnotes, it's hard to say, well, someone should be in trouble for writing that. It's impossible. It's orthodoxy.
Well, I'm just trying to understand why passing the heavenly gift was the bigger problem. Because to me, your first book would be the bigger problem, but I don't understand why.
I believe that passing the heavenly gift takes so much varnish off the institution's history that it makes it look like they failed to perpetuate what was once here, and that they've fallen into disarray. But the end of that book, and I advise readers if they read it to go all the way to the end of that book gives you reason to have continuing faith in the restoration and to remain affiliated and believing. But I think their view was Brigham Young looks bad. Territorial Utah looks bad.
Heber J. Grant looks bad.
Heber J. Grant looks awful. Yeah. But I'm quoting Heber J.
'cause
Grant's journals. That's Heber talking about himself. It's actually Heber recording in his journal what his mother said to him about himself, and then Heber writing about, what his own limits were.
Because that was one of the issues, was denigrating church leaders, right? That's why you were excommunicated?
Yeah, supposedly I denigrated church leaders, but how is it denigrating church leaders to quote the church leader about himself? If he's being candid in his journal and he's telling you, I've never had an inspired dreaming in my life, if he says that his mother thinks he's more concerned with money than he is with anything spiritual, I mean, if he's writing these things in absolute candor about himself in his diary, how is it denigrating him to quote him? It's understanding him. It's grasping the concept that there's a man who is absolutely religiously insecure about his status before God, unsure about where he's going in the next life, standing as the president of the church. He was probably scared out of his mind every time he got up in a general conference to address people because he was hollow inside. He knew he was an empty suit, but he knew what he cared about, and he cared about managing the kingdom and making the kingdom function financially and like a business. And he did his best to do that. Whatever his skill set was, that's what he put on the altar, and that's what he had to alter. But religiously, there wasn't much there. And there are a lot of leaders, I think, sitting down in red chairs in Salt Lake today that would look at the comments about Heber J. Grant in passing the heavenly gift and would identify with that, would say, that's me. That's the awful position in which I find myself. I got nothing to offer. I mean, Listen to General Conference and tell me if you think that's vacuous or edifying, if it's enlightening. Joseph Smith, when he gathered a group together to give a talk in a conference, startled them with an abundant outpouring of new light and knowledge. Talked about how it was his role to always turn up some new thing in order to help edify and move the process along. Well, what we're moving along in a process, if there be one, is real estate development and community development and condominium development and land development and investments in multi-billion-dollar funds. And in that sense, the kingdom is in magnificent shape. The kingdom is prospering at the hands of businessmen. Joseph Smith had a pending petition for bankruptcy at the time he died because he didn't know how to manage money. Joseph Smith was largely responsible for raising the hopes for the Kirtland Safety Society that was an abysmal business failure. Joseph Smith was not a good businessman. He was an awful businessman. In his store, when the poor and needy came in, he gave them away the inventory instead of collecting for it. The store was going bankrupt. Everything he touched, he failed at in business as a businessman. And Brigham Young figured out how to monetize Mormonism and how to turn it into something that would pay off. And the leaders ever since then, they learned some bad lessons. They learned some hard lessons. Heber J. Grant had to go to the bankers in New York to try and get money to make payroll to keep the employees of the church paid, including the compensated general authorities. And those were hard lessons in hard times. So then you have Boyd Packer calling the clerk, the financial clerk of the stake before he arrives, and he says to the financial clerk he wants to know the names of the top 10 tithe payers in the stake for him to interview when he comes out to call a new stake president. And the financial clerk gets upset about that and picks up the phone and calls and tells me what an obscenity this is, but they don't understand the history. The history is that you ingratiate people with money to the kingdom because the kingdom has on occasion run into huge deficits. They were afraid of financial collapse on multiple occasions and were only rescued by bankers back east. Well, now that they've turned things around in the post-World War II era, and they've got billionaires and multimillionaires who are out there, you ingratiate them and you get their loyalty to the kingdom by having them called into positions of authority. They become your stake presidents, they become your bishops, they become your patriarchs, they become your 70s, they become your leaders, because you never know when you're going to have another hiccup. The joke about the Jesse Knight building down at BYU when I was there was that Jesse Knight was a drinking, smoking, swearing Mormon, but he made a fortune in the mining business. And when he finally returned to activity in the church, his tithing that year cleared all of the debts that the church had. And so they have the Jesse Knight building down at Brigham Young University in honor of the tithe that the man paid. There are pragmatic reasons why choices are made. They are based upon historical precedent. They have very good reasons behind them if you're trying to manage a $1 trillion empire as the church leaders are. But you think about what they have. They've undertaken a project in Florida on 133,000 acres of ground approximately. The development costs will be about $1 trillion by the time the project is finished. 500,000 people will live and work and buy groceries and go to school and do everything in life there in that community. They've started that project just a few years ago. There will be members of the Quorum of the 12 who are not yet added to the quorum, who will come aboard while that project is underway. They will live their entire tenure in the Quorum of the 12 and die, and that project will not be finished. They will inherit it as a project. They will babysit through the completion, and they have no say in whether or not that's what is going to occupy an extraordinary amount of time. That's the way the church has wound up today. They've called good businessmen. N. Eldon Tanner helped straighten out a whole host of problems, and they've gone to school on that. Some of the members of the Quorum of the 12 were called specifically because of skill sets that they have in the business community, skill sets they have in banking, skill sets they have in law. To his credit, the current church president didn't come aboard with a background as an accomplished businessman, lawyer, or banker. He came as a surgeon. And that's an oddity among the group that's up there. But I understand and I empathize with the plight. They really don't have elbow room. They've got an empire, and the empire demands attention. They have to give attention to it. And they're doing a marvelous job in paying attention to it. That was not what Joseph Smith set out to accomplish. It's not what the restoration was intended. And if Joseph Smith were here, my guess is he would bankrupt the church. Probably go out and find great causes, poor people, needs, fund whole hospitals, don't charge anyone anything, help the benighted, run into the inner cities and see if you can bring peace and an end to the murdering and the violence that goes on there, improve schools, give away schools, do everything you can to fund an effort to try and rehabilitate an entire nation first, and then the world second. I think Joseph would wreck the church. The kingdom would be in disarray. You would have, the hat being passed to see if we can pay the utility bill for the ward building. It wouldn't be the empire that we see it if Joseph were here, because his priorities were contrary-wise.
Well, I do want to hear your final thoughts on there. Just one more question before we talk about Joseph Smith. As far as, because I know there was a lot of early gifts. I think my opinions in looking at your movement, this idea of angels visiting you is very attractive to some people. Also, I was just curious about speaking in tongues. That was an early gift. Is that something that you've had in your movement?
The way that Joseph had encouraged the tongue thing was to be able to communicate with other people. Yes, the answer is yes, but the way in which it's manifested itself is not something that we've done a lot to publicize, advertise, or speak about. Signs generally attract the wrong sort of folk. So while there are abundant things that have and do take place, they're not spoken openly too much because the wrong kind of people get attracted to that sort of stuff, and we're interested more in substantive, reflective, serious-minded people who are genuinely interested in trying to find and do the will of God. We lost a light.
I know. That's all right. We'll finish up. But so anyway, just wanted to hear your final thoughts on Joseph Smith.
Yeah, I think Joseph is a very misunderstood character. Obviously, he felt confident in his role and in addressing the truth and in testifying about the things that he had experienced. But he was not the character that people make him out to be. Of the two of them, I think Emma was the stronger personality. And I think Joseph was deferential to Emma. I think Joseph had a number of vulnerabilities, including the the fact that he didn't regard himself as well enough educated or erudite to compete with a Sidney Rigdon. And so he gave Sidney Rigdon a lot of deference and a lot of opportunity to demonstrate leadership, because Joseph respected that he was better educated than him. He also respected that Emma was better educated than him. He was shy around women. I mean, the idea that Joseph was some sexual aggressor around women, he was not that. He and Emma were close. You read the correspondence, insofar as it's preserved between the two of them. He was devoted to her, and she was defensive of him and devoted to him. And of their two personalities, she was the stronger of the two. The idea that Joseph would, hold her in defiance and get away with it doesn't match up with what you see to the extent that we've got material to look at to examine their lives. Emma was a force to be reckoned with. And Brigham Young wanted her as a prize, to be able to say, he's got her on board too. And she would not allow herself to be used in that fashion, to her credit. She went to the grave defending Joseph. And Joseph, I think, was bold as a lion in defense of the things that came from God, and oftentimes frustrated at people around him, but he kept interpreting their intent to be exactly like his own intent. So when he uncovers the character flaws of John Bennett, and John Bennett cries and says, don't, let it out, I'll be a ruined man, and he betrays sincerity, and he makes an attempt at suicide, Joseph Smith is convinced he's repented. He's got a good heart. He assumed a lot of people had a good heart who turned out not to have, because he thought they were like he was. That was the flaw. He misread people. He was insufficiently cynical about the foibles of other humans, and ultimately it wound up costing him his life. But he died with a conscious void of offense towards others, because he committed very few offenses towards others, particularly offenses towards women that he's currently charged with. People ought to be ashamed of the way they speak of him. God foretold that fools would hold him in derision, but the noble and the pure in heart and the wise and the prudent would constantly seek blessings under his hand. And part of his hand under which we seek blessings are in the books that we put in print, because I would rather be regarded by the Lord as someone who is wise and noble and pure in heart than a fool to be held by God in derision, as most people regarding Joseph Smith do. They haven't spent the time. They haven't taken the effort. They haven't done the work to figure it out. But Joseph was who Joseph said he was. And if anything, he understated all that he was, to his credit. Anyway, thank you. It's been obnoxious, really, to be sitting here. Let's not do this again.
All right. Well, thank you, Denver Snuffer. I really appreciate you sitting down with us here on Gospel Tangents.
You bet.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Denver Snuffer. Denver, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking. It was really fun to learn about the Remnant Movement, and appreciate all the time that you spent. I'm sure some of you are interested to learn more about the scriptures, such as their versions. They've got 2 versions of the Book of Mormon, as well as the teachings and commandments and some other things. So I've actually created a new page on my website at gospeltangents.com/shop shop/booklist. And you can find not only some Gospel Tangents transcripts there, they will take you to Amazon and you can purchase those. Of course, we'll have Denver's transcript as well. And also you can purchase things like the other books from our guests, including the scriptures from Denver Snuffer's Remnant Movement, as well as other books and even books that were mentioned, such as Adam Clark's commentary or other things like that. So go to gospeltangents.com/shop/booklist. And if you click on the links there, you'll support not only our wonderful authors, but Gospel Tangents as well. We'll get a few pennies out of your transaction. It's not much, but every little bit helps. And I know some of you like to buy books and want to support Gospel Tangents. You can get these at the Amazon prices, which are usually the best, and it won't cost you anything more just to use those links. In fact, do all your shopping on Amazon there. That'll be great. In our next conversation, I'm excited to introduce historian Will Bagley. He's written a book, Blood of the Prophets. And in our first segment, we'll get acquainted with Will and find out what he thinks of Juanita Brooks' groundbreaking book, Mountain Meadows Massacre.
I don't agree with everything Juanita Brooks concluded, but I can't help but recognize her courage.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents. And for just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview without any interruption. If you'd like a paperback version of our transcripts, go to amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview. Also, if you'd like to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website, and I'll be able to send you a transcript as soon as they are completed, and click the subscribe button. You can also find our latest information on facebook.com/gospeltangents, as well as we're on Twitter @gospeltangents. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. The link is at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, and you can subscribe there. Also, please give us a 5-star review. If you want to support all of the podcasts as part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, go to lyceum.fm, that's lyceum.fm, and do a search for Dialogue Podcast Network or Gospel Tangents, because, that's a pretty cool one too. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.